Start?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is our, once again, a WAU webinar. A WAU, as you know, is the World Anthropological Association, which is an organization made out of two cameras of the IUAES and WCAA. WCAA is the World Council of Anthropological Associations, and IUAES is the International Association of Ethnological Anthropological Sciences. So, in this webinar, we're going to discuss the theme of anthropology and surveillance, which is a wide theme, but also narrow in some aspects. And we have several specialists, our colleague anthropologists from all over the world. I want to thank Ricardo Faguaga, for our colleague from Mexico, who takes care of the IT issue. And I also want to thank Michel Bouchard, who's always helped in organizing these webinars. And of course, my colleague, Virginia Dominguez from IUAES, this is a joint organized webinar. And we have, as I said, several colleagues from all over the world. I will now start by presenting them. I'll do a short presentation and I'll give the floor to each one of you. And I ask for everyone to speak in the first round for about 4 or 5 minutes. Then we'll do a second round where people can also react to the comments or to the ideas that the other participants brought up. And towards the end, we'll have a 20-minute period for a Q&A, where the people who are listening to us can either ask questions on the chat or live through the screen, of course. So today I'm going to start from west to east and not from east to west, as I normally do, because I want to thank our colleague Hugh Gusterson, who got up really early this morning to be here, since he's in British Columbia. So Hugh Gusterson is a professor of anthropology and public policy at the University of British Columbia. His research interests center on the anthropology of science and militarism, neoliberalism, ethics, securitization, nuclear policy, drone warfare, and the polygraph. He has written several books, and also he has written on culture of nuclear weapons scientists, drone warfare, and the polygraph. He is the author of the book, exactly, Nuclear Rights, People of the Bomb and Drone. Quite a title. Then we will have Beth Baker, who is a professor of anthropology at California State University, Los Angeles, of course. She has written about migration in the Americas, mobility theory, the immigration rights movement, and immigration detention and deportation, amongst other topics. Her current work examines lateral surveillance in the US, and in particular, the use of home surveillance cameras and crime tracking apps. Then we'll have Susana Durão, who is a colleague from Portugal, but who is living in Brazil for a long while now. So she's more Brazilian probably now than Portuguese. And she's an associate professor of anthropology at the State University of Campinas, known as Unicamp in São Paulo, Brazil. And she's also an associate researcher at the Public Policy Research Center. She has led several research projects on topics such as post-colonial police networks and training in Lusophone countries, as well as the security assemblages in urban settings across Southern Europe and Latin America. Currently, she's coordinating a research and community engagement program focused on indigenous Ticuna security and policing in the tri-border area between Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. Vita Peacock, the next speaker, is PI on the ERC project Surveillance and Moral Community in the Department of Digital Humanities. She is also at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. She is the author of several books, amongst which Digital Initiation Rights, Joining Anonymous in Britain, and co-editor of Rhythm and Vigilance, Ethnographies of Surveillance and Time. She's also an affiliated member of the Mindero Center for Technology and Democracy in Cambridge. Then we'll have Mark Maguire. Mark is a professor in the Department of Anthropology, Maynooth University, Ireland. For the past decade, he has worked on public behavior during terror attacks and the use of force in counter-terrorism operations. He is the convener of the Anthropology of Security Network and author with Cecil Lowe of Trapped: Life Under Security Capitalism and How to Escape It. And then, last but not least, we will have our boss, the coordinator, the president, the chair. That's the correct name. The chair of WCAA, Gordon Mathews, who is an anthropologist at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And he has written about Hong Kong identity in a number of books and articles, and continues to give talks on this topic, even in today's more restricted Hong Kong. And being the chair of WCAA and co-chair of the World Anthropological Union, he is well into this practice of WAU webinars. And we thank you also because, as it is very early for you in British Columbia, it is already very late for Gordon in Hong Kong. So anyway, I want to thank you all for being here and for accepting to participate in this webinar. And we will now start with you. You have 5 minutes, and more or less. I mean, if you talk 4 or 5.5, I'm not going to cut you off. But you have the floor. So you're welcome to start, and you're free to talk about whatever comes to your mind about anthropology and surveillance. I suggest everyone else takes the sound off while they're not talking, because it's just sometimes make it easier, because sometimes there's background noises. Like I'm having some construction in this building, so I will turn my micro off. So make sure there's no strange noises in the background. Thank you. Please, you have the.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for that kind invitation, Clara. I'll try and set a good precedent by staying to time. What I want to talk about briefly is the way anthropologists themselves may become unwitting instruments of surveillance of the people they study. And this should be of particular concern to people studying activists, for example, or doing fieldwork in authoritarian countries. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Catherine Verdery's rather shocking book that details how, unbeknownst to herself, she was constantly under surveillance by the Romanian Secret Service in the 1970s and 1980s. They had a 2,700-page file on her. They photocopied her field notes every week. They put up video cameras and tape recorders in rooms when she stayed in hotels. They interviewed the people she interviewed after the fact, so that she became a secondary mode of surveillance for the Romanian Secret Service. Now, in her case, they had to photograph her notes. It was incredibly time-consuming and laborious what they did. But now most anthropologists keep their research materials on computers, often very mobile computers, laptops. And I want to suggest that this poses an increased danger to the people who we write about. Computers make the state's work of surveilling us much, much easier if they can access those computers. On my computer, they would find all of my field notes, my reflections on everyone I've interviewed. They would find hours and hours and hours of recordings with people that I study, transcripts of those recordings, and they would find a key to all the pseudonyms that I use in my writings so that they could match my writings with the real people that I'm talking about. So clearly this is something that we should be a little bit concerned about. And I want to talk about the danger of taking a laptop across international borders. I found in talking to my colleagues in North America that they are completely unaware of the fact that US customs are completely free to copy everything on your laptop when you cross an international border into the US, a land border or at an airport. Now, if I were in the US with my laptop, the police would need a warrant from a judge to look into my laptop. That is not the case at the border. At the border, they can take your laptop away and copy everything on it, demand your password, refuse to give the laptop back until you give them the password. This has been challenged in court a number of times, and every time it's been upheld as a legal practice. In particular, the Fifth and the Ninth Circuits have upheld it using the logic that looking at your laptop is just like looking at an address book that they find in your luggage. They're allowed to look in an address book, so why wouldn't they be allowed to look in your laptop? According to the Customs Office itself, last year it looked at 41,000 devices at the border. Now that includes cell phones as well as laptops, but a large number of those devices are laptops. I do know with 15-year-old data that they were searching 1,500 laptops a year at the border. There was one particular case, Pascal Abidos was taking a train from Canada to the US. He refused to give his password at first, so they kept his laptop for 11 days. He was a graduate student in Islamic studies, and they wanted to know who he'd been talking to and what he'd been talking about. So laptops are potentially an enormous liability that we have to be very careful of. I myself have 2 laptops. I have one laptop with no human subjects data on it, which I take out of the country, and I never take my other laptop with human subjects data on it out of the country. I do want to finish by talking about one way in which the development of the internet and digital culture may actually help us to protect the people we talk to. So I was on the American Anthropological Association task force on Israel-Palestine. 3 of us went to Israel and the West Bank. We interviewed every anthropologist we could talk to in both Israel and the West Bank, and we had hundreds of pages of notes. It is well known that at Tel Aviv airport, they search you more carefully when you leave the country than when you enter. And so we were very nervous that the notes would be taken away from us or that they would be copied. So in the end, what we did is that we turned all of our notes into PDFs, and we used a website called sendanywhere.com. You can upload PDFs to this website. It immediately encrypts them. It gives you a unique 6-digit code number. You have 15 minutes to phone someone, give them that code number. If they enter it, it will download and decrypt the notes, and then it will destroy the file. So we called my wife in Washington, D.C. We gave her the code number, transferred all of our field notes, and then we shredded the actual paper copies. So there are ways in which the internet enables you to transfer things across borders without them being able to be intercepted. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much. This sounds, I'm getting really scared. It sounds like a Netflix series. I never imagined, number one, that they could do that in the US at the US border, and second, that you would have to go through all the work of encrypting files and then giving the code to someone. It really sounds like a Netflix series, but it looks like it's the real world. So, well, we started off on a very interesting and scary note. Let's move on to our next speaker, Beth Baker. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm very happy to share this space with you. Thank you for inviting me and organizing it. I'm glad that you started out with those comments because I'm going to highlight a different aspect of surveillance studies. I share Hugh's concern, particularly as an activist who crosses borders often. And I've always been very careful with my notes, but really the political activism is when I get scared crossing the US border, coming back in. My phone, it's not just our laptops, it's our phones. And I have so many people's contact information. I remember when Trump was elected the first time, I gave everyone in my phone who is an undocumented immigrant a pseudonym because I was worried that when I came back in and the US government had access to my phone, they could identify undocumented immigrants knowing that I work with them. Most of my work has been around immigration, most of my scholarly work, and I certainly was called to be an activist because of that. The current work I'm doing is looking at surveillance, and I got there through looking at state surveillance. My last project on immigration was on immigrant detention and deportation. And I was interested in the state, the nexus of states and surveillance and state control and policing. And I started trying to understand the culture of policing, which led me to want to understand the culture of surveillance. And I think that governments would not be able to sustain this level of top-down surveillance if people didn't let them. And the majority of Americans are perfectly happy with the security state. They do not share Hugh's and my concerns. And I think this began around 9/11 when people began to compete to see who could be the most compliant with the security state and who could support it more. And now what I see, and I think there may be something of a cultural disconnect, because when I leave the US, I don't see this. What I see here is a consumer-driven surveillance culture where people seek to engage in surveilling each other, where people welcome government surveillance, and where no one is particularly bothered by any of this. And that, I think, is the key to understanding our surveillance capitalism, as Mark and Setha have called it. And it's driven by corporations who are in lockstep with government. So the corporations are perfecting surveillance technologies through consumers. Consumers are actually paying to be the guinea pigs for corporations so that they can help those corporations perfect the surveillance technology. And then those corporations apply it in larger arenas and sell it to governments like the US government. Let's take Amazon as an example. The Ring Camera Company is the largest producer of consumer cameras here in the United States. And I will tell you that when I walk through my neighborhood, I see at least every fifth neighbor has a Ring camera on their front door. I see them cropping up on poles, on power poles, on fences, everywhere. Some of them talk to you so that when I walk down the street of a friend, her neighbor's camera says to me, "Hello, you are being recorded now," as I'm walking on public street on the sidewalk. And so here in the United States, the consumers are embracing surveillance and rushing to surveil each other and to provide this surveillance information to the police. And so there seems to be very little concern among consumers that police are also accessing the information that consumers are recording. Indeed, I think that makes people somehow feel safer. And so the Ring Camera Company is owned by Amazon. Amazon uses this same technology in its factories, in its shipping factories, to monitor and control its workers. And it uses AI to decide whether workers are producing enough boxes to ship out per minute. And so it's AI technology and camera technology, which consumers use to watch each other, is being used to watch the workers in their factories, and then is being used. At one point, the US government had entered into a contract with Amazon to buy their AI technology to surveil immigrants at the border and in detention centers. And there was a public outcry, and they backed off of that. I imagine the US government has contracted with other companies that provide the same sorts of services. And so I think that while that panoptical sort of top-down surveillance is terrifying, I share Hugh's fear of it, I am equally scared of my neighbors who are pathologizing everyday activities through the use of their cameras. And so they're uploading videos from their cameras and talking about them. And the sort of conversations I see and hear are a video of a young woman coming to the door ringing the doorbell, cautiously stepping away from the door, patiently waiting to see if anyone will open the door, knocking on the door to see if anyone's home, waiting a minute or two, and then leaving the property. That kind of activity is being pathologized and being termed criminal as people talk about her. Like, low life is the most common word I hear in my area when people talk about this. Look at that low life. What does she think she's doing? Probably there to steal from you. Call the police, report her immediately. And so I'm actually much more scared of my neighbors than of government surveillance. I think we can be creative and find ways of protecting ourselves from government surveillance. And I'm horrified that people are choosing to surveil each other, to criminalize and pathologize each other in very everyday ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. Well, this is getting scarier and scarier because we moved from laptops being searched at airports to our next door neighbors. So, okay, so now we'll move on to Susana Durão. I think she's going to give us a view of some of the indigenous situation in Brazil. So this will be a very diverse webinar. Okay, Susana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, people. I'm so glad to know you this moment. Well, I am very upset as well, and it's more. I would say, like, in our eco dystopic era, the Amazon is burning. Brazilian Amazon, and this region where environmental and human protection should be paramount, paradoxically remains one of the most violent places on earth. Indigenous peoples are living in demarcated forest and river areas near the borders, are constantly threatened by large-scale agribusiness, mining industry, illegal miners, land grabbers, loggers, biopirates, major criminal organizations, and multinational corporations involved in trafficking of drugs, people, and organs. And they are also subject to corruption and violence within the police state system. So I've been involved in 2 international research projects and a long-term engagement with communities through national programs, and posing these questions. Who is responsible for monitoring the Amazon and safeguarding its human and non-human inhabitants? Or should we refer to them as human and non-human citizens? And how is this responsibility carried out? Well, I'm particularly interested in the indigenous security assemblages at 3 levels, at least 3 levels: environmental, federal security, and local state policing, self-organized land and territorial indigenous guardians, the forest guardians, and self-organized and self-governed policing. Well, my main interest as an ethnographer is understanding the various forms of policing that are organized, governed, and executed by indigenous communities themselves, by, of, and for indigenous communities. Well, I'm conducting fieldwork in the Ticuna peri-urban indigenous communities with more than 8,000 people, which means that they are almost indigenous cities. And they are at the tri-border between Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. And I am very much interested in all these community policing groups, which are organized as associations, but not recognized by state as security, have their own police stations, uniforms, booths, radio, communicators, and batons, and they maintain written reports of organized incidents in Portuguese, but they are mainly Ticuna speakers. And also they remain resilient by conducting regular night patrols within their communities. I am well, what I am interested is, and this, theoretically, I would like to pose some questions to this, and I would like your help to try to begin resolving this. Is this indigenous embryonary public security form, indigenous public security, a form of decolonizing policing in both the Anglosphere and the Lusophone sphere? It is a question. Are these assemblages also unsettling contemporary theoretical frameworks of policing that tend to interpret state and non-state security agents, discourses and practices through a radical evolutionary lens of militarization and genocide, as we do in Brazil? Is it possible that in the realm of indigenous community security and self-organized groups, policing as we know it is being reinvented? Is it possible? What can police scholars, anthropologists, policymakers, and public intellectuals learn from these indigenous models and security experiences? Well, I leave it here. Thank you.
Okay, Susana, thank you so much for this input on indigenous policing problems. And now we move on to Vita. Vita, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Hi, everyone. Thank you, Clara, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here as part of the World Anthropological Union and really fascinated by the discussion so far. So I kind of am proceeding in quite a conceptual direction. I thought I'd use this time to outline 4 themes that I think may be valuable to consider in the anthropology of surveillance. And I should say that these themes have emerged from my own work with privacy advocates in Germany that began about 5 years ago. And my discussions inside 2 collectives, one, the ERC SAMCOM project at King's, and 2, the Anthropology of Surveillance Network, that is a network of the IASA. So the question, just very schematically, thought I'd address is how to study surveillance anthropologically, which is to say through the lens of relations, and how might this differ from how scholars in other social sciences approach it. Number 1, one of the questions that just keeps recurring in this field is the question of technology. Public debates around surveillance, whether it's good or bad, whether it's necessary or unnecessary, are very often debates around technology and the role of technology in public life. So a critique of surveillance may in fact be a critique of the role of computers, not a critique of visibility itself. And in fact, anti-surveillance activists, and I think this resonates with what you were saying, Susana, in some way as well, can often be very pro-vigilance, just not through cameras, microphones, and other devices. On the other hand, actors promoting the need for surveillance in a given setting may actually be promoting the integration of a technology into that setting, perhaps because there is something to be gained from it. And this relation to technology can ramify in really surprising ways. And I just thought I'd highlight this really extraordinary recent study by some sociologists, and I'll put a link in the chat afterwards, of a German company selling facial recognition software for use against shoplifting in French supermarkets. And these companies purport to be able to recognize retail theft with AI and to relay these messages to the internal security in the shops. But what is reportedly happening is that these CCTV images are being live streamed to a small firm of data annotators in Madagascar, who are then recognizing the theft manually and then impersonating AI by sending fake automated messages back to the shops. So what we think of as a relationship to technology, and I think this becomes really vivid here, is just always a relationship to other human beings, sometimes in surprising ways. Number 2, the question of visibility. Often, the thing that often I've encountered a lot doing this project is, that surveillance is sort of ambivalent. There's kind of good surveillance and bad surveillance, and how do we kind of separate these 2 things? But surveillance is morally ambivalent because being seen is morally ambivalent. When is non-surveillance respecting the boundaries of intimacy, and when is it political invisibility? And this question of visibility, I think, is one of the deepest and most challenging to address when it comes to surveillance, and why questions of social categorization like race or ethnicity come up so often with respect to surveillance, because historically constituted ways of seeing then become mediated and magnified through technology. And because ways of seeing differ so profoundly all over the world, as we all know, I would offer this as a place where anthropologists can make a really unique and valuable contribution to surveillance studies, broadly understood. Number 3, the question of participation. When viewed from the perspective of relations, there's a very, very big difference between the surveillance that can only function through participation from the surveyed and the surveillance that can operate perfectly well without any collaboration or consent. So an example of the former might be biometric welfare schemes like the Indian Aadhaar project, or covert mass intelligence regimes such as Hugh mentioned and with Catherine Verdery. And with participatory surveillance, there's often a strong moral dimension, because people actually have to be impelled to go and do something to make it work. They have to go and get their fingerprints done, to file the report. These are all forms of work. And by contrast, forms of non-participatory surveillance, for instance, through some forms of policing or data extractivism, do not require a moral impetus to make them work, because they're just being done. They don't require that kind of level of collaboration. So number 4, final theme, is kind of connected to the previous one. Is the surveillance conceived as embedded within human relationships, or is it conceived as abstract from human relationships? So for instance, an algorithm that's managing the flow of deliveries for a gig economy worker may be conceived as abstract. And this abstraction may also have some kind of intrinsic sort of liberating appeal. You don't have a boss because you have an algorithm instead. By contrast, the surveillance that is fully embedded within social relations, i.e. when the role of the mediating technologies is reduced, such as like a lifeguard watching over a beach or some such, then involves that very tangled space of human encounters. And so sometimes the appeal, broadly, not just, the kind of top down, but also the kind of surveillance that Beth was talking about, of highly technological surveillance, is the kind of appeal of getting away from that sort of messy, tangled complexity of human relationships, but which is also just the substance of social life. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Yep. Okay, because I cannot see myself. I don't know, all of a sudden my image disappeared. Okay, so now I'm a black ghost, but I'm still here. So thank you so much, Vita. We'll now move on to Mark, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I hope everybody can hear me. Not a million miles from the direction of travel that Vita was taking, I'll just say a few words, partially to do with technology, but other things that might also show us parallels later. So I went to a conference hosted by the Surveillance Studies Network, which is quite an important group, about 10 or 11 years ago. And after a gap of 10 or 11 years, I recently went to another one of their events, and I discovered that nothing had changed, which was quite interesting in the world of surveillance. As a friend of mine put it, a lot of Latour, no ethnography. But there, well, it's a trite comment, but it's true. There was a distance, I felt, between the researchers on the actual topic. So in the spirit of maybe saying what happens inside surveillance machinery and why ethnography is important, let me just say a few remarks about edges and centers. I'll dispose of everything under those rubrics, a bit cheeky. So I recently finished a project. It was only a year long, but there was fairly remarkable access, doors open from the European Commission level, to look at covert counter-terror policing in a number of different airports in Europe. So myself and a colleague of mine, Pete Fussy, went on operational deployments, did all the things you could do, basically, and were given access to an awful lot of their data as well. So in conclusion, he says, taking out the entire bit of detail in the middle, what we started to think about was edges and centers. and two almost countervailing forces that seem to be dominating what's happening in the world of security and surveillance these days, particularly for police, but also more generally. So on the edge, there is, of course, literally what we now call edge computing, which essentially means that an awful lot of surveillance technology happens, or the processing is local. Now that requires vast databases that are distributed and interoperable. It requires AI training, etc. But what it means is that facts are produced in locality when something is seen. So it's not simply raw data that gets processed, as Bruno Latour would have said, in some center of calculation somewhere, or a data fusion center in the US or whatever. So we've become more fact-like in surveillance. And that has all sorts of implications. And I think at an event that Vita organized, I explained, at least as far as I could see it, how these implications are understood as dangerous within security institutions, particularly counterterrorism organizations, policing, intelligence groups, etc. So the first thing they talk about is opacity. They call it the problem of opacity. So the systems are now so complex that those people operating them cannot see into them. So they're not serviced by recognized officials. They're often outsourced, of course, or insourced, yet another trend. But they're not visible to the operator. If something goes wrong, even if there was an expert on hand, they're not able to explain what's gone wrong to the people in charge. That's called the problem of explainability. And lo and behold, there's also what's called the problem of accountability. So if there's an absolute disaster, nobody's actually responsible because nobody actually was in charge. So the edge has become a massive problem in the world of security and surveillance. The other thing that's a real problem, although it certainly doesn't seem like a problem, perhaps a topic to be rejoiced, is the collapse of the center. So if you speak to any police force, military force, intelligence body across the Western world and beyond into Africa and Asia, the first thing they'll say is that they have no people. They've run out of people, basically. Let me give you some examples. Australia has a 30% deficit in military recruitment. The United Kingdom can't field an army. The United States Marine Corps can't get Marines. The list goes on and on and on and on. I'm currently looking at recruitment to the British Triforces at constituency level, which is quite interesting. And the decline in recruitment is up to 300% in some areas. So what we have is a people-less future in which the computing is not transparent, is not explainable, and there's a lack of accountability. And I think it gives us a sense that maybe surveillance is not all it was supposed to be. That was a short comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And now, last but not least, our colleague Gordon Mathews, please.
Okay. I'm going to speak about surveillance in a more directly immediate way. You're all well aware, I think, of the protests that swept Hong Kong in 2019, leading the mainland Chinese government to impose the national security law on Hong Kong. And this has led to very significant new surveillance as Hong Kong becomes less like Tokyo and New York and more like Beijing and Guangzhou, like a mainland Chinese city. Mainland China has long had an extensive surveillance of its citizens in terms of cameras in public, surveillancing everybody, and face recognition technology. Also, extensive mass media monitoring and the censoring of mass media. Hong Kong is not. And to newly experience the beginnings of this censorship has been a great shock to many in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, right now, there are two types of surveillance. There, first of all, is what the authorities may directly encounter in public or on social media. For example, the song Glory to Hong Kong, an anthem of the protest, can't be sung or hummed. Somebody who played it on a harmonica was jailed last year for a couple of years for simply playing the damn song on a harmonica. Slogans pertaining to the protest can't be publicly proclaimed. If you wear a t-shirt with certain slogans, yeah, you're going to jail. Aside from that, there is the National Security Hotline, which enables anybody who perceives that there has been a violation of national security can call this hotline and get somebody in trouble. Teachers are often quite worried about this. You give a student a C and they may call the hotline. Now, Mostly the people who have been jailed so far have been political proponents of democracy. Journalists, too, though, have been jailed who have been thought to be favoring the pro-democracy cause. 300 people have been jailed through the national security law. Others have been jailed under other statutes. Political opposition has, in effect, ended in Hong Kong. Now, academics have not been jailed for their academic activities. That's not happened, but they have been for their political activities. Secondary school teachers have been curtailed by a stringent curriculum change. Liberal studies has been replaced by national education. But university academics do remain relatively free. One academic in history in my university, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, was denied a renewal of her visa. So she was basically kicked out of Hong Kong. She was a Tiananmen Square specialist and was quite active in talking about this. But in my own anthropology department, we've been told by the provost that as long as we teach critical thinking, showing multiple sides of every argument, we should be okay. I do this myself. I teach a class called Cultures of Hong Kong. I spend several classes talking about the 2019 protests, giving these protests from multiple points of view. What did the mainland government think? What did the protesters think? What did the US think? What did various groups around the world think? So it's free now, but how much longer? With the National Security Hotline, many academics are engaged in self-censorship. This is direct in my own life. Last May, talking about the protests, one Hong Kong student was talking about her role, and then she immediately said, "Stop," and she pointed out a mainland student next to her who was recording what was being said. Now, was this student simply recording for the sake of her English, as she maintained, or was she making a recording for surveillance reasons? We don't know. Just today in my class, a mainland student, a woman from Kazakhstan actually, but who lives in China, was saying that my statement that in Xinjiang there has been a re-education camps for Muslims was American propaganda. A Hong Kong student jumped in and argued back. I mean, it became rather intense, although I think we all left friends, but who knows what may come. I know in my own background, there was a 2019 article on the mainland saying that I was polluting the minds of students that some students now have read. Now, most of the coverage on the mainland of my own work has been positive, but nonetheless, that is a worry. One student was telling me today he was amazed I was still allowed to teach, and I'm happy that I am. I am teaching by critical thinking. I am a centrist, but nonetheless, there is this ongoing worry of surveillance, and it's definitely going on. Now, James Chen, the China representative to WCAA, has discussed with me the situation in mainland China, more repressive than Hong Kong. He was talking about how there's a camera in every undergraduate classroom, in theory anyway, monitored by the Communist Party. And he said, look, you get used to it. In China today, anthropologists can teach about some topics like heritage and business, but not about other topics. You can't teach about civil society, you can't teach about gender, you can't teach about religion. These anthropologists are being surveilled and could get in trouble. They could lose their jobs. Many Chinese do accept the role of the Communist Party in their lives and think it's a force for good. It's a Western fallacy to think that most Chinese resent the Communist Party. They don't. They think it has made their lives better. However, in Hong Kong, many people have been raised in ideals of democracy and openness. Hong Kong has been Western more than Chinese, and they do indeed resent what they see as the greater control of China over Hong Kong. That's why you've got 150,000 Hong Kongers who've emigrated to the UK over the last 3 years and other places as well. Hong Kong is becoming more and more assimilated into China and more of a surveillance regime like China. This has not yet formally limited anthropology, but we await the future. I myself will be retiring at the end of this year, so I'm probably okay, but I do fear for my junior colleagues because of what may be coming. Thank you.
Okay, Gordon, thank you so much. So we've had inputs basically from many regions in the world and totally different topics, from being surveilled at the US border and having laptops being also taken, to Americans who surveil their neighbors, to indigenous Amazonian populations being surveilled and violence used against them. We've had several inputs from Vita on how to study and look at surveillance, and also from Mark. And now we ended up with Gordon and the specific case of surveillance in China and how it's kind of pouring into Hong Kong, right? So now we will have the second round, in which each person will again have 4 to 5 minutes. You can go back to your issues, new ones, or you can engage in debate with some of the comments and questions and issues that have been brought up by the other speakers. By the way, I just noticed that I presented myself and I presented everyone and I forgot to present myself. I'm sorry. My name is Clara Saraiva. I'm at Institute of Social Sciences, University of Lisbon, and I'm also the co-chair or the deputy chair of WCAA, the World Council of Anthropology Organizations, and I've been convening this webinar since the pandemic started in 2020. And please go to our website in WAU and you'll be able to see all the webinars that we've had thus far. They are all posted there. So we'll give you an idea of all the variety of issues we've been approaching and debating in these webinars.
And
Okay,
Clara,
so
did you present Virginia too?
I didn't. Sorry, I didn't. I did mention Virginia in the beginning when I said that this was a joint venture, an organization of WCAA and IUAES, and I said that it was me and my colleague Virginia Dominguez. So Virginia Dominguez is there now. She's in the board. She's the secretary, right, of IUAES, and she is at University of Illinois. Of which university are you in, Virginia? I'm sorry, I'm lost now. In Indiana? No, you're in Illinois. Illinois. I can't hear you. Well, anyway, in the poster, there was only the name of the speakers. But yeah, me and Virginia.
Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Exactly. Illinois, Champaign. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go to the second round now. We'll follow basically the same order that we had before. So we'll start once again with you.
Thank you very much. These were really fascinating comments that we heard from everyone. I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end. So for a second round, I wanted to sort of reverse the vector of surveillance, if you like. In my first comments, I was very worried that anthropologists could become unwitting instruments of surveillance for the state. This time I want to recommend a way in which we ought to be engaged in a democratizing kind of surveillance. And the jumping off point for my reflections here is Laura Nader's now quite old article from 1974 on studying up the anthropologist is the title of the article. And she points out that overwhelmingly anthropologists have tended to focus on relatively poor and marginalized communities. We have tended to study communities that the state fears and would like to control. And so it's not just that what's hidden on our laptops in terms of our personal notes is of interest to people in power. What we openly publish is also of interest to them in helping them to control welfare beneficiaries, drug dealers, people who live in ghettos, activists, and so on. And so Laura Nader encouraged us to study elites, to make them transparent to other people. And she pointed out that the unaccountability, the inaccessibility, the invisibility of elites is part of their armor. We just don't know really how they function, how they pull the strings of power to get what they want to get. So I want to point to a few recent ethnographers who I think have been doing interesting work in this zone of studying up and making transparent to everyone how power functions. I think the ethnography that immediately comes to mind that has been very widely praised is Karen Ho's book, Liquidated, which is a study of Wall Street bankers. She was able to leverage her own training at Princeton, where a very large number of these people are trained, to worm her way into their networks, to show how people are disproportionately recruited from Ivy League universities, to show their sort of indifference to the people who suffer as a consequence of their decisions as hedge fund managers and so on. She went into some detail about how takeovers and downsizing get affected and how the people responsible for throwing hundreds of thousands of other people out of work think about what they do, how they celebrate it, how far removed they are from the human consequences of their work, the kinds of financial bonuses they get as a reward for doing that, a kind of underlying arrogance and disconnectedness in their world. So that would be one example. If I can be forgiven, a second example would be my own work with nuclear weapons designers. I've spent 3 years off and on living with nuclear weapons designers at Los Alamos and Livermore in the United States. I've been interested in how they're recruited, been particularly interested in the effects that surveillance has on them. They have to completely open their lives to the state to win a security clearance. They get polygraphed every year to see if they have betrayed state secrets to anyone. They know that at any moment their lives can be inspected by people from the national security state to see if they've been sharing secrets they shouldn't share with other people. And there's a disciplinary effect of this. They're not quite sure where the line is between what you are allowed to do and what you aren't allowed to do. And in a situation where you don't know where the line is, you stay as far away from the line as you possibly can to play it safe. So the very uncertainty about the borderlines of the rules has a very powerful disciplining effect on them. And I find that privately, a lot of them will express reservations about American nuclear weapons policy that they would never express in public. Another thing I found is that they almost never discuss the ethics of their work with each other. Over and over and over again, when I interviewed people, they said, "You are the only person I've discussed the ethics of my work with. We just can't talk about this in the workplace." And then they are physicists after all. They have an underlying confidence that the people who oppose their work are stupid and uninformed. They tend not to think of them as having a different ideology, but as being irrational or not having access to the right information. The third person I'll talk about briefly is Janine Woodell, an anthropologist of public policy at George Mason University, whose book Shadow Elite and her book before that on Jeffrey Sachs and other economists who restructured Eastern Europe in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War is compulsory reading, I think. So other things that I would love to see, I would love to see studies of pharmaceutical companies, how they decide what drugs to make, how they fix the clinical trials, because the clinical trials are rigged, studies of law firms, studies of urban developers, studies of city councils, studies of government agencies, and so on. I'll leave you with two concluding thoughts. First of all, there's an interesting question whether anthropologists can do this work in the framework of our current ethics policy. And I should say I chaired the AAA committee that wrote our ethics code, so I'm kind of attached to it. We have a norm against covert research, but it can be very difficult to access some of these elite contexts if you're doing so openly. And I'm thinking in particular of an ethnography I have very, very mixed feelings about. It's called Gender Trials by the sociologist Jennifer Pierce. She approached law firm after law firm after law firm, asking if she could do an ethnographic study, and they all refused. So in the end, she disguised herself as a paralegal. She got a job at a law firm. She did a year or so of covert fieldwork. Are we comfortable with that? Is that a price we're willing to pay in order to subject people with tremendous power to the kind of accountability that ethnography can embody? And finally, I will say, my wife at one point had a Senate confirmed position running a US government agency that was vitally concerned with security issues. So I had amazing ethnographic access to someone who ran a 4,000 person federal agency. Every night when she came home, I would get out my tape recorder and I would tape record all the details that she felt like sharing of high-level meetings she'd had with senators and other kinds of people. Now, she felt okay sharing that privately with me on tape, but there are lots of details in there about other people's behavior. She and I have never written about this, and I'm not quite sure ethically what the status is of the information in those recordings, and would welcome any advice on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hugh. I'm frozen again. My image freezes. I don't know why, but you can hear me, right? Okay. Yeah. So you don't see my lips moving, but I'm here. I don't know why it's frozen. Okay, so thank you so much for this input again. So we'll move on to the second round of the next speaker. Beth, please.
Thank you. I think I want to highlight the fact that we as anthropologists have long engaged in the business of surveillance. And the way I'm framing my current project is the watchers are watching each other and I'm watching them. And I take pride in not owning a personal security camera, but I often ask myself if I'm any better because I am surveilling other people through other means, just as much as they're surveilling each other. So I think that there's room for us to reflect as anthropologists on the fact that we are surveillers and what does that mean in relation to ethics. And we do have codes of ethics, but we're still surveilling people. And now we can understand more deeply how that feels to be surveilled because we're all always being surveilled all the time. I think of the technology we're using for this webinar. I know, for example, that the Zoom company, which is what most universities use in the United States, they actually keep recordings of everything in their corporate office. And the owner of a Zoom account may request those recordings so that if you have a class session over Zoom or a meeting with your colleagues, your university could, in fact, access that information. And so when we do political organizing, then we're very careful, like what technology we use, whose account. So I think that we are all implicated in surveillance in everyday ways that we may not be reflecting on actively. And that might add another dimension to our discussion. The other set of issues I'd like to bring up is that surveillance is now popular entertainment. Indeed, many people spend most of their entertainment time in watching surveillance, circumsurveillance entertainment video rather than video produced specifically for entertainment or media produced specifically for entertainment. So I have a feeling that one thing that people like about home security cameras is that it's entertaining. Many people have the cameras turned inward on their home and they like to just watch their pets, children, their housemates for entertainment value, not because they're worried, they just like to watch. And that reminds me very much of social media. Social media is surveillance, and social media is one of the primary ways that people connect and interact with each other, particularly young people. And it's also one of the primary ways people engage in media entertainment. Of course, there's reality TV. And the earliest example may have been the webcams, which are still used, where people just train their webcam on themselves and others can watch them for entertainment and pay to watch them for entertainment. And so I think that there's a lot of room to look at the nexus of surveillance and entertainment. And we might even use other words besides entertainment. Maybe social, that has become our public sphere in the lack, and especially during and after COVID, in the lack of actual meaningful public spheres, surveillance has become the public sphere. And social media, I think, demonstrates that. I know in the instance of the home security cameras, there are whole YouTube channels devoted to just showing footage from people's home security cameras, and other people just sit and watch security camera footage from people they don't know. The other part of the work that I'm doing is on the crime monitoring apps. And so the principal one that I'm using is called Neighbors, and it's actually owned by Amazon and the Ring company. Ring is owned by Amazon. And it appears as Facebook. It looks very much, the feed looks very much like Facebook. And so it mimics the entertainment value of Facebook. But it's where people upload their camera footage and then have those interesting conversations about what that footage means to them. And then their neighbors comment, and it starts a whole sort of geolocal, geographically specific conversation about what people are seeing on their cameras and the meaning of that footage. I've had tremendous difficulty getting people to agree to do interviews. I have interviewed 6 people who own cameras and asked dozens and dozens more. And people really don't want to do these interviews. These are my peers, neighbors. There are people who are socially and economically about where I am. So it's neither studying up nor down. But they really don't want to do the interviews. So most of my data is coming from the apps. And I've never had this problem getting people to do interviews. I've always had an ease in finding people who will talk to me. But around the cameras, people are really scared to talk. And I haven't quite figured out why, but the apps provide so much data, people are willing to surrender all of the information I would have asked them in an interview in the context of an entertainment app. And so again, I encourage us to think more about the sort of cultural implications of surveillance as entertainment and the ways in which consumers engage in that market willingly.
All right, Beth, thank you so much for your input. Now we'll have Susana again, please.
Well, I would like to return to some conceptual questions based on this context I am working in. I would like to, and maybe I think this raises questions for all of us in surveillance studies, the centrality of this kind of critical diagnoses that are always produced against, let's say, against the ungovernability of security or surveillance, but also morally and politically engaged by specialists, and apparently with partial solutions. I mean, for the Amazon case, there is a profusion of reports that I would call reports of lament, in a way refining incompetence while eternally hoping for the system, the state and the organizations, but also the social movements and the indigenous people themselves to find solutions for what's going on, for the problem of Amazon and governance. So this could be called, I'm just, just trying to think with you here because it's all new, but we could call this kind of ungovernance discourse fetish, and we all can enter into it easily. For instance, there is one particular technology, surveillance technology, that is implied now in what is considered a kind of solution for the Amazon danger and security. That is the drone. The drone as a savior technology that can identify the criminal activities, the criminal groups, the miners, and and be a way and be a kind of help technology to for indigenous organized groups, guardians, to identify and evidence what's going on in the field. It's like a kind of sky security provision with a group maintained by voluntary indigenous people, transformed, I would say forcibly transformed in indigenous activists for lives and places for which collective national and international responsibility is not assumed. So it's like the hope of technology and with indigenous people maintaining that technology, hair technology, from the ground to assume the responsibility that is not taken by other actors, you know. So I'm kind of worried, and I'm really because it's a kind of political and also critical and intellectual discourse that I think it's romanticizing perversely the eco-responsibility of the forest people, so to say. And because this is becoming a problem for me. And the groups that I came to know, this kind of policing groups, and that also do territorial vigilance, and also try to identify invasions of the demarcated areas. They are telling me some ethnographic things that we should pay attention, we should listen, and we should understand the ground as it is, not as we hope that is trying to find a solution. So they are telling me some things like they are not concerned with like targeting people as the Western security does. They do not call people like bandidos or something like that. They primarily seek to halt what I term the flux of indigenous death. So they are much more interested in maintaining people alive than to identify criminals. So this changes all the question of surveillance and security. This makes the problem much more complex. But they tend to act in bodies, what they call revolted bodies, the revoltados, that are people that are under the influence of some substances and that are equipped with weapons like bows and arrows, and that they kill. So this also raises some questions, because the problem is not the external enemy alone, it's the substance, and the people are living with that substance into bodies that they have to be controlled in order not to kill. So it's kind of different from what we could expect. Also, problem of authority, performance of authority. These are the security guards are like, they call themselves fathers and mothers. So they tend to see themselves as kind of concerned elder people, or with kind of authority, in order not to lose the community, not to let the community fall down. So this also transforms the question of security and surveillance. And they also, just another 2 points, they involve the community in correction. They involve the families in correctional punitive or conflict situations. And they also address non-human bodies, non-human substances. So, and they also base their activity in community support. So they consider they are doing something for the community, so the community must pay them in several kind of ways. So it's not this activity is not based in the leader singular indigenous hero. It's a kind of collective work. So what I mean is, just to finish, that we have to pay attention again of what's really going on with our kind of instrumental ethnography to understand the complexity of relations, as Vita said, and all relations, human, non-human, post-human, under-human, and see how we are probably thinking about security and surveillance, sometimes in a very distant way of how people would like to happen in the field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana. Now we'll have Vita, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just going to respond to some of the things that were said, so I won't talk for very long. Hugh raised this question of methodology, and I think this is a really, really central question of how we're doing fieldwork now in the 21st century. And I do get the feeling like we're in the middle of a very paradigmatic change in anthropological fieldwork. I think Catherine Verdery's work, kind of scrutiny of her file is a really important contribution, sort of first contribution to this discussion. But there's also the work of Joseph Masco, talks about himself being potentially surveyed, Denis Ionuju. There's also a research note in Surveillance and Society Journal by a scholar called Jasmine Dagnola called Fieldwork Under Surveillance. She's not an anthropologist, political scientist. But I think this is becoming relevant for all social scientists who do field work as a really, really, really urgent question. And I think a response from us as anthropologists, I think partly, would involve thinking about, I mean, my first response would be to think about medium. And I'm really glad that Hugh raised this question of the computer, because I feel like we've all gotten to the point where we rely very, very heavily on computation as method. But that actually that comes with, because of the advances in AI, that just comes with so many risks that didn't maybe exist 15 years ago. I mean, my privacy, the privacy advocates that I worked with in Germany were like, well, if you record this interview, then that's not an anonymous interview, because, you know, all the computer needs is like an hour of listening to someone talk. And because of advances in voice recognition, then that can immediately be linked to an identifiable person. So is computation actually antagonistic to the ethical principle of anonymity that we've always relied on? And does that suggest that we should think about other media? You know, does paper acquire a renewed value? There's also other forms. I mean, I'm interested by this file transfer website. I'll definitely look that up. Forms of encryption, you know, ways of using computation as well. And then I guess the second response, one response would be medium. The second response to this kind of major shift in ethnography I think we're all going through is then the question of representation, and how do we represent our the subjects that we work with. I recently experimented with trying to characterize ethnographic subjects while not using any identifiers that could be categorized as personal data under GDPR. One, because of the kind of increasing complexities of data protection regimes in European funded projects, but also because of the people I was working with were privacy advocates, so this was a central concern for them. And this was just an experiment. I mean, I wouldn't say this would necessarily work more generally, but it was an interesting experiment to think, you know, how deep you can go in with the question of representation and what else might come out if you're not identifying people's hair color or distinguishing marks or things like that. And there's already also, I think, a kind of creeping body of work that is really thinking about doing representation differently, partly sort of under duress, but in different kinds of contexts. And I think another good example of this is Puccio Den's study of the Sicilian mafia craft, where she really kind of writes an ethnography of silence. And I think that the idea of silence, and so the question of representation, I think, is also where we as anthropologists can be very creative and creatively respond to these political pressures. Thank you.
Thank you, Vita. So we'll move on to Mark.
Thank you. I'll be fairly quick. So I said in the first iteration, that at least in my humble experience, that the whole area of security and surveillance, the agencies that dominate these areas are experiencing a contradictory crisis of center and edge. And yet, of course, not that I'd have to say it, they remain extremely powerful, and we continue to pour unbelievably large amounts of money into funding the security industrial complex in Europe, America, and right across the world. Obviously, Russia would be an obvious example too. And we invest in them hopes and utopian fantasies, including fantasies about their power. And I think in part of what I'm trying to do is sort of temper that understanding. But I want to switch slightly, and maybe it goes close to some research that Vita has actually done, to say a few words about the defenders, the people standing up and saying, no, stop, that kind of thing. And it, probably not necessarily a kind word. So let me just caveat it fairly heavily. First of all, I'm not talking about the kind of grassroots activists that Susana's work speaks to in any situation which I've had contact with activists of that type, for example, victims of police or military violence or migrants, border crossers. They have been impressive people with a very clear set of goals. I'm talking about a slightly different cast of characters that I think have dominated an awful lot of the discussion of surveillance and security. And many of them are academics. So let me just give one example, and then I think maybe others will want to pull at the threads. But recently, the European Union, after unbelievable amounts of lobbying, finally allowed the AI Act to crawl through. With so many amendments, it's actually quite hard to interpret it. But it is very interesting when we look at areas that were quite frightening to people, like predictive policing, advances in interoperable biometric systems, that the AI Act seemed to be a bulwark, or at least was touted as such. It probably isn't. Most of the technologists I've spoken to say unkind things about it, and have pointed out exactly how it's already been superseded. But what's interesting to me is the cast of privacy activists, human rights defenders that surface during these societal discussions and actually tend to dominate those discussions. So the AI Act, for example, on predictive policing alone had a joint submission by 50 agencies, NGOs, and then separate, completely coordinated, as one might expect. What strikes me as amazing about some of these defenders is not so much that I wouldn't agree with an awful lot of what they said, I don't, nor is it the fact that they often get factual matters completely wrong, but how samey they all are, as if, to go to his point, there is a transnational elite, but one we like as academics. They tend to be lawyers, tend to be very senior academic lawyers or corporate lawyers who do have very strong, grounded moral view of the world, but are, shall we say, in a smaller world than they think they are. And I find that fascinating. And I'm just saying it to encourage others to do the research, perhaps not me, that there is a group there that have managed to set the record wrong publicly in an awful lot of different accounts, but have never been scrutinized. And I'm just saying this as to signal maybe one of the many topics in which are accessible to ethnographers and would be receptive, I think, to the use of ethnography to temper their views, to maybe give more rounded and complex understandings. I'll say one unkind thing and then I'll finish. The most obvious thing to me, and maybe this is a typical anthropologist, you see the obvious and miss the non-obvious, but is that the boards of trustees are elites. And many of those organizations entirely subsist on the contribution of precarious graduate students and unpaid activists. But it is an industry all on its own that has escaped scrutiny. And I think if we are to truly, in the round, debate surveillance, we need to take account of those actors in various parts of the world. We encounter them in Africa, we encounter them in Asia, Europe, and America. But like I said, they've escaped proper scrutiny, perhaps with the caveat of, in the case of the development industry, shall we say, that's been different. But in this area, it has yet to be done fully, with the exception of Vita's work on privacy. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm next.
So Gordon,
Yeah.
last but not least.
Okay. These cases you've all been talking about are incredibly important, but they are mostly very high tech. And also, I mean, frankly, you guys are speaking more in an academic realm. I do feel that, I mean, I am seeing surveillance constantly. I teach a class and somebody is seated in the back of class I don't recognize, taking notes. Who the hell is that person? I don't know. This happens every week. So this is a part of my life now. I am an American passport holder in Hong Kong. I am a foreign force in the midst of a global power struggle between Western liberal democracy and Chinese communism with very different ideals, and with China going through a somewhat anti-foreign phase. You know, so I do represent someone who would be surveilled in this context. Now, my own response to this is to teach critical thinking, saying that we should not take sides, but teach all sides and let students choose. I do that in terms of student protests. I also do it in terms of things like patriotism. I mean, I think I can ask in a class, is patriotism all in all a good or bad thing for the world? That is somewhat a dangerous question, but I think if I bring in all of the good and bad and let students decide, fine. And that's what I do. So a student can get an A in that question if they answer yes or if they answer no. Let students themselves decide. But the big question here is critical thinking itself a violation today? Is this something that can get me in serious trouble? It could in China. What about Hong Kong? My university was ranked 38th in the world recently. It's desperate to keep these high university rankings. Is critical thinking still going to be allowed, or is that going to be sacrificed? We will see. I will see. Now, one matter I've often thought about is that, I mean, my academic work is readily available, but there's so much to be surveilled, it makes some sense that maybe no one is paying much attention. Maybe as long as I'm not super famous, I can get away with whatever I do. There's so much data being surveilled, but nobody's actually watching it. That's what my friend James in the mainland tells me, that yes, people are always being monitored on the camera, and yet if no one's watching the camera, it doesn't make any difference. You can probably get away with a lot if no one's paying attention. But I assume that I am being surveilled. I'm on YouTube and Facebook. I'm a minor celebrity in Hong Kong, but I am a centrist. I wrote an article about why I'm still in Hong Kong, why I've not left as so many foreigners have. And I haven't left, as I say, because I love this place. This is my home. I want to die here. Hong Kong is my home, and my aim is, I would hope, the same as anybody who loves this city. So to me, my own existence here is an indicator that maybe I can teach in the kind of way I teach, write the kind of way I write, and still be accepted. Maybe those who are doing the surveilling can accept the presence of somebody like me. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I hope I'm right. Thank you.
Okay, Gordon, thank you so much for finishing in a very, I think, positive note of, well, or at least partially positive. So thus far, we've had so many, different contributions from you all, and so many different aspects of what surveillance is about, from the first issue that you brought about laptops being surveilled to the case of the indigenous populations of Susana, and the question whether surveillance can always be looked at from a negative side, right? What's the good thing that it can do, for instance, for indigenous populations, or to, for instance, all the issues that Beth brought up of people enjoying surveillance, which is something that really strikes me. I mean, for me, it's very, very, me personally, as a person and as an anthropologist, it's very disturbing, not only that your laptop can be searched at the border, but also that people, my neighbors, enjoy surveillance. I think, we really, it's like the big brother is watching you all the time, and I don't agree with it. I mean, I don't think we should go that far, but we have come this far. So what can we as anthropologists do? And how can surveillance, how can all the work, I think something that Beth and I think Mark also brought up is the fact that we as anthropologists, we've always worked on the basis of, we interviewed people, we have information, we have protected their identities. And there are so many rules now all over the world about personal information protection. and it's totally ambiguous and contradictory to the fact that everyone is being surveilled, right? So it's like two antipodes where on the one side, yes, you cannot release information. We as anthropologists, we've always done photos of people because people is one of our main, it's the object of one of our work. And now we cannot post the photos, but at the same time, people are being taped and surveilled. And so what do we make of this? I'm now opening the floor not only to the participants, but to anyone who wants to participate. People can participate in this debate either through the comments on the chat, so writing down on the chat, or wanting to come alive. I think Ricardo will let them in. If you have any questions or comments for the participants. But I don't see anything in the chat. Normally, while the session goes on, people come in, but I don't see anyone. So I don't know if this chat is really working as it should.
Clara?
Yeah.
Can I don't know. Hopefully there will be other people, but can I ask a very basic question?
Of course, go ahead.
I know that I heard from someone, I don't know, in the last couple of days, asking me what I meant by surveillance. And I said, well, it means lots of different things in different contexts. And I think we've seen that here today. But I wonder how people would answer that. Because part of me thinks surveillance has negative connotations. It has associations with authoritarianism. But at least a couple of people here have actually pointed out other aspects of it. I don't know, neighbors using cameras to survey each other, Beth. I mean, yeah, it's a very good example, but are they all the same? I mean, there's a part of me that thinks that anthropology has always been into surveillance. So I don't know. Is it provocative enough?
No, I think it's provocative, but yet I think you addressed exactly what I just mentioned and what Vita spoke.
Right.
We've been surveillors of others in a sense, right? Yeah. And now we're also being surveilled, and also the focus of anthropology or the dogmas that we used are now of course totally shifted, and so we have a much more critical thinking, and in this age of digital information, we have to do that very carefully. Now, there's a few questions online.
Oh, yeah, that's right. There we go.
You has a question for Beth. Do you want to please?
Sure, and I see there's another one for Beth too, so maybe they could be rolled together. I was really fascinated by your comments, Beth, and I was wondering about a website that I joined a year ago called Nextdoor, which is proliferating all over the US and Canada. And, sometimes it's just, I'm looking for a dog walker. Can someone suggest a dog walker? But often people say, oh, I saw this terrible person and I didn't get their name. Does anyone know who they are? They were feeding ducks, which is illegal in Vancouver where I live. And all these people will pile in and try and identify the person who they think broke a law. It sort of reminds me of my stereotype of communist China, where all the citizens are coming together to try and turn people in. I wondered if you had any comments on Nextdoor.
Beth?
Yeah.
Before you answer do you mind me reading just the other question that was here for you? Because that way you can perhaps answer them together. So there's Clarice Russell asking, hi Beth, I'm so intrigued by your research on neighborhood surveillance. How often do you find the police are interpelled by ordinary citizens in the US? So the question is being posted here now. So if you could answer those two, and then next I will give the floor to Vita, who wants to respond to some of the issues that Virginia raised, right? So please, Beth.
Thank you. I think we can do a more fine-grained analysis of the ways in which people are talking about each other and watching each other. And it is going on across a variety of apps and forms of technology. People can also, I think it's very common for neighborhoods to create groups on like Facebook, and then to share their sort of surveillance observations with each other via Facebook, which wasn't set up for that. And so it's interesting that ordinary people are sort of taking technology that was not used for the purpose of surveilling those around them and using it for that purpose. And by creating a more fine-grained analysis, I think we need to start looking more closely at who is doing that, in what context, how, and why. And so, for instance, one person I interviewed who lives in North Carolina and bought a home in a community where the developer put cameras in every home so that when you buy a new home, it already comes with a Ring camera. And she noticed that on her side of the neighborhood, where most of the residents were people of color, that people were using the technology to say, hey, I saw your dog running down the street. Did you know your dog got out the yard? Whereas on the other side of the neighborhood, which was predominantly white, people were using the technology to be racist. And so they were making comments about children of color running across their yard. Again, pathologizing what used to be very normal human behavior. Children used to be able to run across people's yards. As long as they didn't damage anything, it wasn't really an issue for most folks. But now we have these sort of watchers saying, hey, these children are running across my yard and they're acting like animals. And so they're invoking racist images and metaphors through the technology. And so I think we can start to develop a more fine-grained analysis of how consumers are using the technology in different ways, and it's not uniform. And then the ways in which police are involved, my sense is that people are frequently calling the police to report things that are not crimes. I would like to interview a police officer at some point, but I do see people on the app saying, yes, I reported this to the police and they said there's nothing they can do. And so I think that even the police are probably being overwhelmed by just hundreds of calls criminalizing everyday activity, which is can't be policed.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. Vita, you wanted to interact with some of the comments that Virginia made, and then we'll go again to the comments on the web, on the chat.
Yes, no, just really briefly, I really welcome that question that Virginia posed of what is surveillance, because I think this is a really, really central question. And I think, also responding also to Beth's comments about how, that feeling that you as an anthropologist are also sort of implicated in this process. And I think I've had to confront this for the last few years, because every time I sort of talk about the project on surveillance, I was like, oh, well, you're an anthropologist, as you're always confronted with that tension of how is what you do made different to how, to a surveillance apparatus. We recently defined, and I mean, this question defining surveillance is, it's very contentious in surveillance studies anyway. We defined it in a recent encyclopedia entry as just kind of watching over through a technology for a purpose, kind of keeping it as broad, as sort of open-ended as possible. But it's that question of purpose that I think can really differentiate what we do as anthropologists from what maybe how other entities or agencies, what is your aim? What is the aim of the visibility? What do you want your research to do? And how might that be different from how someone's looking at their door camera footage and, and what do they want that footage to, what are they doing with that kind of active recording? But yeah, I just really welcome the question.
All right, thank you so much. Now we have a few more questions in the chat. There is a question by Ruslan Yusupov, where he wrote, thank you for this conversation. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the transnational outreach of surveillance in policing and its impact on the pursuit of academic inquiry. Authoritarian regimes now pursue various tactics of intimidation, even if the anthropologist leaves their field site and no longer crosses the border. How does one navigate these challenges? But we had another question before that one, so I'll read two, and then whoever wants to whoever wants to respond. It's a question by Toiba Bashir. Can you please throw some light on over-the-skin surveillance and under-the-skin surveillance in correspondence with the types of surveillance and how both of them correlate with each other to have biopolitical control on people under control? Actually, I think Beth's previous answer did shed some light into this, but if anyone wants to add anything, so let's go to both these questions that I just read that were in the chat, please. If anyone wants to address
I will
them.
talk to Ruslan if I could a bit.
Please.
Because Ruslan, I know you've had some difficulty in China, and many non-Chinese anthropologists aren't going into China anymore because they feel that the surveillance will be too great given the current climate. I can mention some specific names to you offline, but I won't mention them here. It's just becoming too dangerous to do research there, and governments are opposing anthropological research there. The reach beyond the realm of China is quite troubling. And how much will China attempt to control what is written by anthropologists in a range of other countries about them? If you don't agree not to publish this, for example, you will never be allowed in China again, or more, we will find other ways to harass you. I don't think that's going to happen, only because, frankly, most of what we anthropologists write is irrelevant. And that's just bluntly put. So I think we anthropologists who think that, we're going to be surveilled and jailed and so on, probably engage in a degree of self-importance. I may be doing this myself. Nonetheless, I know from your experience and many of our experiences, China is quite prickly at this point, and this kind of authoritarianism is becoming transnational, maybe not only for China, maybe this will happen to other regimes as well. I mean, certainly all of you here, all of my fellow panelists are describing surveillance regimes that are increasingly becoming transnational. How much are we going to be watched? How much can we academics be ignored because we're not having a great impact on the world? That's a really big question.
Can I make a couple of points, one on each question? So in terms of the effect on academics, I think we have to remember that if you train as a graduate student in a particular culture area, you invest years and years and years in learning, about the culture of China or the culture of Nigeria or wherever it is. And if you're denied access to that country to do more field work, that can have devastating impacts on your career because of that investment. You can't just go somewhere else and start afresh without investing enormous amounts of time in developing a new geographic area of expertise. And if you're a younger scholar who's coming up for tenure and you haven't yet done enough research to get tenure, then the implications are really, really serious. If you're an older scholar and you've done years and years of research in a country and you're denied access, you have enough material in old field notes. You can keep publishing, it doesn't matter so much. And then in terms of the question about above the skin and under the skin surveillance, I'm not completely sure that I understand the difference between the two. But my last field work was on the polygraph, the lie detector. I was trained as a polygrapher, and I'm now a certified polygrapher. I assume that the polygraph is under the skin surveillance. You measure people's sweat, you measure their breathing, you measure their heart rate, and conclude from that whether or not someone is lying. I'll bracket the question of whether the technology is reliable, and I will just say that it is spreading enormously. It's spreading to Eastern Europe. Israel is training lots of Eastern European polygraphers, and the US is training polygraphers from Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, well, not Venezuela now, but in the past, and so on. And it's spreading into new areas. So the big growth area in polygraphy right now is marital fidelity testing, where it's usually men bringing their wives in and having a polygrapher verify whether or not they've ever been unfaithful to their husband. So this is a growth area, both for the national security state and for private citizens who want to know if they can trust their partners.
Well, that's even scarier than before. It's getting worse and worse. Okay, so does anyone else want to react to either Clarice or Ruslan?
I can take up the under the skin one slightly.
Mark? please.
Yeah, just that was quite an illuminating comment actually from Hugh. I noticed as well the return of lie detection in Europe. It's now being pushed by lawyers again, who are claiming that if police had more tools, they'd be less likely to use physical force. So even though lie detection technology is at best iffy, they think it's a better option than beating people on the soles of the feet. And they might be right on that, but it's strange that that came back, shall we say. So just a real quick framework that might be used just for above and below the skin. Obviously, most surveillance historically was extrinsic. It was how somebody looked and their aura, shall we say, in terms of haircut, moustaches, etc. None of that, of course, actually is very useful in most contexts. So the biometric revolution was an effort to, from the 1990s, it was obviously invented by Galton in the 19th century, but it was an effort to use intrinsic features. And just after 9/11, there was a huge explosion in experiments to use both biobehavioral metrics, but also just very odd things like body odor, gait analysis. The technology wasn't there, it was too immature. Maybe this is something to do with polygraphs as well, but it's all back in the last 2 or 3 years, I've noticed. Gait recognition, even use of retinal tests, which were originally removed because they're too slow. You have to put your head into a machine pretty much, and they have a diagnostic function. So you can verify somebody, but you now know if they have cancer or not. So there's all sorts of interesting phenomena have been bypassed recently, and there's a kind of a return of very bad experiments, put it that way. But all of that to say something, because I think the question is about how are they coming together. I think they were always together, actually. It's just a question of what tool can be used by a specific government or agency at a particular time. But they've always had a relationship to each other.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I don't know if anyone wants to react to those two questions, or we have another question here about James Chen, who actually asks, well, something that has been, I think, in the background of some of this discussion, of this debate, which is, are there any positive impacts of surveillance, such as community security or safety fighting crimes? I mean, I'm totally not knowledgeable of such issues, but I think that's how it started, right? Surveillance started to prevent crimes and to prevent bad doing, but it from what we see now, and especially in our perspective as anthropologists, it has surpassed this. So I see Beth and Vita raising hands. So please, Beth, go ahead.
Thank you. The first surveillance technology we know of was created by the Nazi regime.
Mhm.
And so surveillance has always been about social control.
Right.
I think only in our imagination is surveillance a remedy for crime. There is very little to no evidence that home security cameras prevent crime, help solve crimes, or produce security. What produces security is people talking to each other and helping each other. And so I'll tell you a brief story. One of my colleagues who owns a security camera, he and his neighbors noticed a person walking down the street with a hammer, and they were banging on things in the neighborhood and acting erratically. At that point, they could have called the police, which is what most people who use security cameras do. Instead, these two neighbors walked out to talk to the person. They realized the person was in the throes of a mental health crisis, was hungry and thirsty. And they worked to establish a relationship with the person who lived on the streets of their neighborhood, and to provide food and water, and to talk to the person about not hurting others. And that is how you create actual security, not through the surveillance, but through interacting as humans and finding solutions to our very trenchant local problems. And so the cameras are incidental, and I believe that the cameras have the effect of making people feel as if they can be safe through the use of technology, while they allow their actual social relations with real people to wither, or they fail to create actual social relations with real people. And I do believe that's how we create security.
Thank you, Beth. We have Vita and Gordon that wanted to say something.
Thanks, Clara. Yeah, I'm just going to offer a slightly different perspective from Beth on that question. I mean, I think this is a really important question that James raised, of this kind of idea of positive impact, because there is work in surveillance studies. There's this particular book by a scholar called James Rule called Private Lives and Public Surveillance, which is a study of the UK mainly and the US, and in which he shows that actually, somewhat paradoxically, the foundations for a kind of surveillance state in Britain began with the post-war welfare state. And actually, I think the question of welfare, and we're seeing this currently in India with the Aadhaar project, is actually historically extraordinarily important for the distribution of surveillance, because then it becomes a transaction in which you're exchanging for a social good. There's another book by a guy called Edward Higgs called The English Information State, where he goes even deeper into this question and talks about sort of pre-state forms of registration in parishes and how that then laid the foundations for subsequent forms of surveillance. So I think there's quite a bit of dispute on this question, but I think this idea of community safety actually is surprisingly central to how these kinds of norms can be distributed, but then obviously, twisted into well beyond what they're originally intended to do.
We have Gordon and then Virginia, and then we have another question on the chat, and we're actually coming. We have like 10 more minutes because we shouldn't really go over 2 hours. But Gordon has the word.
Virginia was first, actually.
No, go ahead, Gordon.
Sorry, I thought you had raised your hand first.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question, James, and you're speaking from China. My own experience in China is that the coming of cameras to a city like Guangzhou, and this is circumstantial anecdotal alone, certainly caused the number of pickpockets to go way down. I realize, Beth, you're the expert in this and I'm not, and I realize it's a complex issue, but there may be in very large scale some benefit to having this kind of surveillance. I talk to students about this sometimes, and they say that as long as I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm perfectly happy to be surveilled. And I guess that's my own position. I will assume that everything I do is being surveilled, but I'm doing the things I'm doing I believe in. Now, the problem is when the state defines things as crimes that shouldn't be crimes. And I think that's what's happened in Hong Kong. That's the great issue, that if we all belong to, liberal democracies where the criminal code did not make something criminal, free inquiry criminal, then surveillance wouldn't be so frightening. Now, I know there's the surveillance that a couple of you have talked about here, the surveillance of Facebook and Amazon and so on. That is a problem. Various people have warned about how awful that is. I honestly don't understand this as fully as you guys may, because I'm not an expert in surveillance the way you are. I don't see that as a particularly negative thing. What I do see as negative is if a regime can define behavior that seems morally proper as criminal and thereby start jailing people accordingly. And James, back to you. That's the worry I would have in China, where things that would seem perfectly reasonable to talk about nonetheless can lead people to being jailed. So there can be positive impacts, but only depending on how surveillance is going to be used. Would you agree, James?
Thank you, Gordon.
Okay, I'd love to hear, James, what he would say, because we have arguments all the time about this. But anyway, fine.
James is not coming up, but Virginia wanted to say something?
Right. One is for Susana, but the other is a comment relating to something Hugh said. I think Susana was largely talking about the creation of the development of community policing among indigenous groups. And I wonder if that is a good form of surveillance or just a different level of surveillance. So that was for Susana. The other thing is about Hugh. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but you're absolutely right that the kind of ethics codes that a lot of us have for anthropologists, I don't know, they make a lot of the work of studying the elites kind of impossible. And I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm a past president of the American Anthropological Association, but I think maybe we need to relax our ethics codes a little bit to argue for what we're not studying, because we can't do that. Law firms, I don't know, Wall Street brokers. So there are all sorts of people who simply would not want to be studied, and I've experienced that. So,
should I take? I would like to say something about the idea or the concept of surveillance, because it seems to me that it's very it's always related with people and property, and probably there's other angles to understand that, or for instance, when we look at the idea of indigenous surveillance, there is a kind of moral good of doing of having a way to understand something that is bigger, that is like collective property, collective good, a collective good. So this is interesting to make us questioning like modernity or what we think of. It's just an idea. The other, the question you raised, Virginia, the thing, I think community policing, as we understand it, it's, for instance, in some places of Africa, Asia, and others, it's a kind of, it seems the same questions. It seems the same phenomena. But I think in the case of indigenous people that are guarded by the state, that do not have their own fields, that do not have their own lands, because the Brazilian state do not, indigenous people do not have their own property, so they are a kind of, they are always citizens that have certain limits in their own existence. So this raises a lot of big questions like justice system, legal pluralism, the idea of intercultural critical forms of organizing security, and which insert, of course, there's some parallels in other regions of the world, but I think and we have been, me and Beatrice Choragi, with the Canadian case, we have been trying to compare, but there is question of state recognized practice, and that makes all things much more difficult in the Brazilian case. But it's a long story.
Okay, well, thank you, Susana. Now, we're almost like it's 4:55 p.m. Here in Lisbon, so 3:55 UTC. So we've been here nearly 2 hours. So I will end up with a general question that came up on the chat by Jelena Haynes, and she's thanking everyone for sharing the knowledge. And then she asked, is there a university policy relating to anthropological surveillance? It's probably a very complicated question, but I would just ask to wrap this up. Any of you who want to comment on this before we leave? Or is the question too complicated?
Well, I assume that Virginia would be the person to answer this because she knows the global landscape.
Oh, no. I'm just in the background. You guys are the experts, right?
I do know that different national anthropology associations do have fine-grained differences in their ethics codes.
They do, and some don't even have ethics codes on purpose, like the French.
like the Portuguese Anthropological Association. We
Yeah,
decided a
too.
few years ago not to have it because we thought it was too, it would constrain people and that it was
Right.
unethical to have ethical code. So,
But there is also the issue of institutional review boards.
Right.
So I noticed at my university that there are things the Anthropology Association Ethics Code says I can do that the Institutional Review Board says I can't. So there's that very complicated jurisdictional issue too.
Yeah.
I think it is indeed, I'm not an expert at all, but I think it is indeed to have an overall, an overall code or an overall surveillance ethic for anthropologists or university policy regarding anthropological surveillance. I think it's not so much, perhaps it's not so much anthropological surveillance that Jelena was talking about, but how do we anthropologists deal with surveillance? I mean, there's no universal code for how we should handle this.
Right. Clara, let me say something that relates to both what Hugh has said and what you are saying. I know that not all anthropological associations have formal ethics codes, but I do actually think that all anthropologists care about ethics, regardless of what their association does and does not. So, in some ways, people define ethics differently. Some people, for example, back to what Hugh was saying, what I picked up on, the people studying law firms or lawyers or judges or something like that may actually define their ethical emphasis not so much in terms of protecting the lawyers or the judges, but rather putting out there some information that others may not have. And that is an individual choice on the part of the anthropologist. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, actually, Jelena Haynes is thanking here because she's in Australia, so it's 2 a.m. there. She's been up listening to us, so it was worth asking her question. So, okay, everyone, we're about almost 2 hours in this webinar. It's more than enough. We normally last 1.5 to 2 hours tops. Otherwise, it's tiring for everyone, for the participants and for the listeners. And well, first of all, I want to thank you all. I think it was a very, very vivid and interesting webinar. And I think we were able to see how much this issue of surveillance actually is so manifolded. It has so many aspects that it's actually, we'd probably have to do several webinars, each one addressing a subtopic of the issue of anthropology and surveillance. So we might do that later on, we'll see. But this was very, very interesting, and it was very good to have all your inputs and your different expertise on the issue. And the webinar will be posted within the next few days in the WAU website. So you're welcome to watch it and also spread the news so that people can watch it, especially the ones who weren't able to attend right now, stream live. And well, thank you very much, and have a very nice day or very nice evening or very nice morning, depending on where you are. And thank you very much. And let's hope we're not too surveilled this time. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.